Hey everybody, this is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist, producer, songwriter Randy George from who's currently playing with the Neil Morse Band. So,
Thank you.
morning, Randy.
Good morning.
Getting started from the beginning. All of our readers always like to kind of get to know a little bit of the background. It's my understanding that you're originally from Colorado, like I am, interestingly
Oh,
enough. And
well, yeah, that is true. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado.
okay,
I
I'm
grew
from
up in Lakewood.
there. You go. I'm from Boulder, so not too far away.
Uh,
Always like to think that good things come from Colorado. And
yeah.
you're currently in Southern California with us, but let's go all the way back to Colorado. You initially started, if I'm not mistaken, on piano, not bass per se. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I was 6 years old, I started taking piano lessons, the sort of the usual fare for kids in that day,
Hmm.
which gave me my initial understanding of music and how to read music at that basic level. But 6 years later, when I was 12, I really wanted to play bass,
Gotcha.
largely because in those years, I was a huge Moody Blues fan,
Okay.
and I guess what drew me to the bass guitar was looking on a picture on the back of their In Search of the Lost Chord album. There was pictures of the band, and one of them showed John Lodge holding his Fender Precision bass,
Hmm.
and I loved the four big tuning keys right in a row on the headstock. So I said, "That's cool. I want one of those."
Nice.
I had no understanding really of. I kind of knew what the bass did, I think, because from playing piano, I understood bass clef from treble clef.
Sure.
Um, but as far as applications in a rock band, I was just really at the beginning of discovering, the role of the bass, and of course, it was in the music of the day, which was in the '70s. So
Hmm.
naturally, when Roundabout was being played on the radio, that really attracted my attention, and I really gravitated toward that song largely because of the bass line. I like that real ankle bony sort of, you know, sound that he got, and I thought it was really cool. So yeah, I sort of grew up adopting, Chris Squire as sort of my role model for bass players. But I was also a big Moody Blues fan, although the bass was distinctively different. Um, yes, was really my musical, aspiration at the time. That was what I wanted to be.
Gotcha. And how did you transition? Did you just since you already had a background in music, are you more self-taught? Did you decide, okay, I'm going to start lifting tunes? I think a lot of us do that when we get our hands on an instrument, but what was your approach at 12 to get going with bass?
Well, as far as I can remember,
Hmm.
uh, I think one of the first things I did is I learned I'm just a singer in a rock and roll band because
Hmm.
it had an interesting bass line, dun, 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 bum, bum, and that was the sort of thing that, like I said, that drew me to the bass to begin with. And I think that was one of the first tunes that I tried to learn. And I had a Fender Music Master bass and a Music Master amp, which are not real big.
Hmm.
So it fit conveniently on top of the big wood stereo console with the flip up thing and the turntable and the radio, right? The speakers built
Yeah.
in. So it fit really nicely on one of the sides. So I set it up there and put on the record, and I started playing along with that, and ultimately I started, playing along with Beatles and Paul McCartney stuff, and
Hmm.
anything where there was a moving bass line that was interesting to me. Yeah, it just sort of grew from there.
Gotcha. And how did you transition into playing with a group? How'd you find you start one at school or?
Well, yeah, oddly enough, in the ninth grade, there were three guys that needed a bass player. He was a guitar player, drummer, and well, there was two guitar players actually,
Gotcha.
but the drummer could play keyboards too. It was kind of a funny situation, and they had a gig and they needed a bass player. It was only about 6 songs, but and one of them was "Smoke on the Water," which turned into an extended jam where I mostly played lead on bass. And they, for the next few years, as I played with some of these guys throughout high school in bands and whatnot, we were doing mostly classic rock songs, Rolling Stones, BTO, REO Speedwagon, but the bass was always I was way overplaying the songs. I would sort of just throw in all these riffy things in these songs that didn't really belong there, and they hated it. The bands hated it. People loved it, but the band themselves, can't you just play the bass line the way it's supposed to go? That kind of thing. So I don't know. That's kind of what I did in most of my high school years. But it was clear I wanted to do more than just play 3-chord rock.
Sure.
And I was listening to Yes or Kansas, late 70s. By that time it was Kansas and Steve Hackett, the solo career of Steve Hackett, Genesis, ELP. So Rush came along, even though I didn't exactly like Rush at first. Ultimately, they became one of my favorite bands. And so ultimately, there was a lot of really cool bands with cool bass players. And so I never quite fit into that basic, give me 3 steps kind of vibe. As far as like musically, this is what I want to do, because I'll play the song, it's fun, everybody's having a good time, I don't have any problem playing it. But that's not where I'm at musically at all. So I never was either. I think from the very beginning, my aspiration was to pursue something unique and something where I could be free to, where I was free of the ideal that, the bass should do this and this should do this, as if anybody really, could really state that.
Got you. And how did you transition? Because I know certainly those of us that have played in bands during school times, it's just kind of one of many things that we're doing, because as we're growing and there's juggling girlfriends and sports or cars or whatever we're dealing with, just in the aging and becoming people kind of thing. How did you transition to bass as a main pursuit? How did that, like the profession that you wanted to do?
Having grown up, learning piano first, and I suppose that I was able to, I always had a good comprehension of how to play bass and piano, and therefore guitar at some point. I just sort of picked it up naturally and instinctively. I knew I could put several things together to make music. And so, I started doing ping pong recordings with, cassette decks and things like that, just to try to experiment. I wrote songs, and there's plenty of drummers around, so, finding a drummer to play with wasn't usually a problem. There was plenty of small studios where we could go record. And then ultimately the little Tascam Porta 5 cassette, thing came out, and I really dove into writing more. By that time, it was the end of the 80s, but, mostly, there wasn't always a keyboard around. There came a point where, the family piano kind of got sold off with the estate, after my mom passed or after my dad passed, which was, at an early age for me. And so I didn't really have a lot of other direction in life. I wasn't a sports guy in school, so I didn't have to juggle sports. I skied, but I did that recreationally. That wasn't really about competition for me. I always had a car, so, wasn't really struggling with the car thing. And mostly it just became, I had a truck for a while, Ford truck, so I'm the guy that basically hauled all our gear around. So the truck just becomes part of it. You put everything to work, your resources to work, to support what you think you want to do. And of course, throughout the 80s, as things changed, my thinking changed, and I got caught up in that, just like everybody else did at the time. I suppose the only thing that really came along that I really don't put myself into in the mid-'80s was I became a aerobics instructor.
Okay.
Yeah, I did that for quite a while. And it was a great way to get in shape and meet women because up to that point I didn't exactly have a lot of girlfriends either. You know, I was a
Gotcha.
musician. So, and a bass player, no less, who was in progressive rock music. So, you know, I was sort of destined to be without a girlfriend. However, yeah, I think the biggest transition to go, I don't know if there was really a specific point to go full time with bass because in the 90s, like I said, with the onset of home recording, sequencing, and all that kind of stuff, I was able to write and develop more of my own ideas, and it gave me, you know, a better perspective on where I wanted to go. And throughout most of the 90s, quite honestly, I played more guitar than I did bass.
Okay.
When I did Agilon, you know, I was mostly the guitar player. Even though I recorded a lot of the bass parts in the music, when we played live, you know, I played guitar.
Gotcha.
So even in my solo material in the early 90s, when I started writing a lot of solo material, I played guitar because it was more of a challenge at that point. I had played bass for so long, I felt like I had more to gain on guitar, more to learn, and it just had more of that appeal that I really enjoyed doing this. So throughout the 90s, I sort of did it all, but I was mostly a guitar player right up until I joined Neil Morse.
Okay.
And then I switched back to bass because it's not like I ever gave up playing bass. I actually kept, you know, working bass very figuratively into my solo world too. Mm-hmm. But at the time, you know, Neil needed a bass player, and I felt like I certainly had the most to bring to the table as a bass player, so that worked out.
Got you. And as I listen to Neil Morse Band's music, and I get a real feel. It's kind of funny because people tend to try to pigeonhole music into genres. And I get a real kind of classic rock feel from it. It makes me think of, you know, back in the days when a lot of it was kind of almost rock opera-ish. There was more of a message. There was more of a sequence. It wasn't so just plain repetitive, because I think a lot of the rock, like from the 60s, you know, you had a chorus, you had a few verses, and it was just cycle, 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 cycle. But listening to Neil Morris's, it's got a much more intricate path that it takes. How do you guys feel? Is it prog rock, or how do you kind of situate it?
Yeah, I'd say it's classified as progressive rock.
Okay.
Prog rock, yeah. If you know, the term gets thrown around a lot these days. I think it's always just been the term, when they say progressive, is always been a polite way from way back to say that you just aren't fitting into any normal mainstream box. Okay. You don't fit in anybody's box. You have your own box. So, you know, you progress beyond what, you know, some portion of society is established as a norm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what a lot of the 70s bands suffered from. They weren't another genre when it started. They were the ones that didn't fit into the existing genre. They were the misfits. Mm-hmm. It became so big, and because they were in the 70s, they were able to grow an audience over the last, you know, 4 or 5 decades now, I guess. You know, to humongous sizes, and Genesis by the end of the 80s was playing to some of the biggest, you know, crowds anybody was. Mm-hmm. And even the big bands like The Who, U2, really are a little bit progressive when it comes to the idea of mainstream pop or rock. But, you know, only those bands from the 70s were able to sort of maintain that huge arena audience status. And even many of them haven't been able to hold on to that. It's dwindled so much over the years.
Sure.
But I think, you know, once prog sort of died, which it did at the end of the 80s, because throughout the 80s, urban pop sort of came up and overshadowed everything. And the only progressive rock being done was in Europe mostly. And very little of it filtered into America. Yes, and Genesis had both found a pop compromise to what it is they do that allowed them to basically be fresh and new, utilizing mainstream channels. Mm-hmm. And so they weren't seen as the misfits as much as the giants, but they were able to fit into the mainstream boxes at that point.
Gotcha.
which is where the argument, once Peter Gabriel left Genesis, things changed, or more to the point, when Steve Hackett left Genesis, Genesis really changed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, see, and then Steve Hackett maintained his progressive sound and his style throughout his entire career. And he's always been inventive, but he's never fit in anybody's mainstream boxes. Neil Moore's band is sort of a little bit of everything, and so you'll find bits and pieces that if you were to cut them out like a slice of cake, might fit perfectly into somebody's mainstream box.
Mm-hmm.
But it's usually woven into a much greater tapestry that nobody really wants to mess with. Because it's like, well, until you do better, until somebody does something that people like better than this, this is what people are holding to high regard. And I'm only saying that based on what I see the fans saying.
Sure.
I feel like most of the time, we go through and write a Neil Moore's band album, I do something differently, and I'd probably be even far more eclectic. Sometimes I think we're a little too predictable in that respect. And but Neil is very natural at it, and he's very good at it, and that's what people really love. Mm-hmm. And so I would certainly not want to take that away from the audience, because that's what endears us to them. And I kind of like that, because I've always liked good pop songs. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really bother me that much. But I also like when we can branch into some really unique musical passages that have some really cool aspects to them. They're both fun to play, and it's challenging to play as an ensemble. So that's another big whole part of it. It's not just the songs themselves, but try playing it together as a band. And we struggle to bring the music to the stage sometimes. It's not always cut and dry for us, and it sometimes takes a bit of time for things to fully, come to their fruition. So,
gotcha.
It's a lot. It's a lot to remember. It's a lot. You have to really concentrate to play it. So
I gotcha. Well, and I think a lot of times it's like, even like when we're talking about food, if you're tasting something, people, the way they describe stuff is try to find something else that it's similar to. It tastes like chicken. When you're talking about you trying something unique. And I think a lot of times that happens with music. People hear it and they go, well, that sounds kind of like this, but I found listening that there's a lot of unique areas with Neil Moore's band. And so I'd hear a piece and I'd go, okay, that sounds kind of like Styx back in the day a little bit, but then it's got, again, rock opera-ish kind of thing, but it's an interesting insight that progressive rock is kind of a point of view at the time kind of thing. And then you look back at it and you may be, okay, that was a little more mainstream or whatever. So it's kind of interesting how that definition works. I saw that you guys have been releasing lately actually quite a few videos. Man in the Iron Cage, City of Destruction, So Far Gone. Lots of activity going on. What's going on with the band? What's coming up for us here?
Right now, the band is engaged in the tour.
Okay.
Videos came out last year with the album, mm-hmm. in advance of the tour, and they've met with very, very good results. They worked for us on a number of levels, largely because you kind of have to be visual in this day and age, because 90% of your mainstream outlets are visual outlets. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's necessary, but at the same time, you want to present the music, especially when you're giving it to people for the first time and making a first impression. You want there to be a way about it. Similitude has been an album that happens in a specific order. You wouldn't just play the album in a random order. You could, but the whole thing was designed to tell a story. So, it's kind of hard to mix it up. So we tried to release all the videos in order of how they appear on the album. So we've been very fortunate that way. This year, we're undertaking what is approximately a 40-city tour across 4 continents.
Wow.
So we have done the U.S. leg in Cruise to the Edge already, and we're getting ready to start in Europe next week in Barcelona for the European run, which will end in Israel. And we're headlining Rozfest in May, and then we have 4 dates in South America and Mexico for June, and then 9 more dates across the Northeast U.S. in August, which that will end with Morris Fest in Nashville, which is our big 2-day event where we do full albums.
Nice. And because a lot of our audience is worldwide, if somebody wants to look into seeing you guys on tour, what's the best website for somebody to check for that?
Well, there's a couple websites that the band employs that have all the information available. You can always find it at radiantrecords.com, and you can always find it at neilmorrisband.com. And
Gotcha.
all the live dates and links to tickets and VIP are there.
Excellent.
So that would be the, if otherwise, any other site that reports, what bands are on sale where, and
sure,
especially if they have something regional, hopefully everything is been promoted through mainstream outlets. So anywhere they have media access to that kind of stuff, it should be there somewhere.
Gotcha.
At least it's what you always hope.
Totally. And as busy as you are with the Neil Morris Band, because you're so diversified, what other musical projects, what kind of things, or is it all right now Neil Morris?
Well, I've always had side things going on to some extent. In the mid '90s, I had my band Agilon, and so that was something we did right up until 2010. Rick Wakeman was the guy who brought that band to the forefront on his label. Throughout the 2Ks, I released a series of Christian progressive rock sampler CDs that basically took all these different bands who clearly had no resources with which to release anything other than a home, spun CD, or some of them were professionally done as well. But we basically wanted to go across the whole gamut and find bands that, fit under that banner to just give it a name and a face in a bigger framework. Those did very well in their time. It's a paradigm that no longer really is relevant, but at the time it seemed like a good idea, and sure. I think it served to spread news about a lot of bands.
Mm-hmm.
I've also been known for being in various tributes from time to time. I've done Yes tributes, I've done Genesis tributes. I figure if I'm going to go out and play music, unless it's going to be original, I want to play music I love.
Yeah.
So currently, the biggest thing that I'm doing has been the Steps in tribute to early Steve Hackett, where we took those first 6 Steve Hackett albums and we're bringing a show that's just called from those albums, songs from those albums with, as note accurate recreations and sound accurate recreations as possible, and to just really just try to bring the music and let it live the way it sounded to us off of those records in that day, because they were such an impact to us. It's not so much anything to do with what Steve Hackett is doing now, because he tours a lot and he even does some of the same songs. He's Steve Hackett, and he's the original, and we're not trying to be him. What we're trying to do is bring the sound of what we've heard on those albums to the live stage. The artist himself would never think about that. As a matter of fact, most albums try to think, how can we make this more interesting than what was on the album?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, with the test of time and the place that those albums occupy in the hearts of the fans who embraced it at the time, it's a thing unto itself. So it's really sort of it's just a unique fan perspective, I guess, because I'm bringing what I would want to hear as a fan, even though that I love to hear the way Steve does a lot of the songs today. Whatever Steve does is great because he's Steve.
Yeah.
You just accept it for that. I don't expect it to be something else. Mm-hmm. But I know that in the past, when I used to go see bands live and they do one of my favorite songs, and it would just be all different. Like Roundabout. Roundabout was never the same live as it was on the studio recording.
Mm-hmm.
It never felt the same. It wasn't the same. The band wasn't even thinking about what was on the album. They're thinking about how to play this song live. And they think it's a rocker. So they want to play it faster, or they want it more upbeat. They're not thinking about, that classic rocking. When I say rocking, I don't mean proverbially. I mean sort of, if you know anything about drumming, or if you can feel drumming, Bill Bruford just had this as opposed to the live versions, which always ended up being you know what I mean? Very different feel. Mm-hmm. And the band would never attempt to do that. But as fans, it's like, that's what I want to hear live.
Sure.
I want to hear that drum part. I want to hear the feel of the bass and the drums on the studio recording. And then it maybe just be unique to me, but to me that brings something to the live performance that the live band never would on their own.
Gotcha.
So again, it's just all about playing the music the way I would want to hear it too.
Gotcha. Well, and I've heard a lot of groups talk about, especially when it's their original music, that it still goes through an evolution. And when they're touring, a lot of times the fans will have the essence of something if they've been listening to it before, but it does. It's got differences that they thought, oh, this would be better if we did this, or let's change this way. But if you really liked it the way it was, on the album, and you listen to that, like I tend to listen to something over and over. I'll beat it to death. I don't mind listening to the same song like 10 times in a row. It's not a problem for me. But then if I go see it live, it's going to be slightly different. And I think also as musicians age, when it comes to vocalists, there's some groups that you go, I don't know how they could sustain singing in this key, because it was like way up there. And then you'll hear as they've aged and they're touring, they'll maybe drop an octave on that. You're going, okay, you used to go up on that note. Now you're staying down, because anatomically it's where you can go. It's just things change. So that's very very true in the evolution of things. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about gear. All bassists have a little bit of gear acquisition syndrome. What are you playing on?
What am I playing on? It depends on the gig.
Okay.
Specifically,
with Neil Morris, what do you?
With Neil, the thing about with Neil Morris music is I've tried a lot of different basses. Now, in Similitude of a Dream, I did use 4 different basses. I had 2 different Spectres that I used, and a 65P bass, period correct P bass that I have, and a fretless. So I thought some of this music imbibes a certain, like you said, maybe some of it might sound a little like classic rock, and I thought, well, it'd be nice if the bass sounded like a classic rock bass. So flat wounds on a P bass, and you have that clunky bottom end. And it worked for songs like Ways of the Fool, mm-hmm. which is the primary song that he did that on. It also worked on Freedom Song quite well, because it has just it supports what's going on in the song a little better. Whereas, in the overture, when everything is big and majestic, the sound of the Spectre, that big, that big splatty, spongy sound, is much, it just works better in the mix. And I've always used this 99 Spectre. Morris band albums here. And this is the one that I got for the Testimony tour in 2003.
Nice.
And this is recorded on pretty much all the Neil Morris band albums. All the most, for anywhere from 100 to 90 to 100% of the bass on every Neil Morris band album is in this bass.
Nice.
Yeah, I have another one it's more of a grunty sound. It has an alder layer on the bottom of the body, a layer of alder. So it gets more of that P bass, clunky, grunty, mid-range honk, which doesn't work in Neil Moore's music. The one time I tried to use a different bass in Neil's music was on Testimony 2, the album Testimony 2. And that is a Mike Law Thunderbird 4-string. So it's a very grunty sounding bass, tough, mid-rangey, but it doesn't have that crunchy teeth, teeth that just sort of cling to the mix. It's sort of this big tubby, anchor that sits on the bottom, and it's great, but it just doesn't quite have that same cut, doesn't have the sharpness, brightness to it. However, on the bonus disc on Seeds of Gold, I use this bass so you can hear a profound difference. Pretty much, I've found that this bass works mostly in Neil's music, and primarily because it is two pieces of figured maple, top and a bottom piece of figured maple. It's not layered. It's Brazilian, African rosewood on the neck, so it's a very hard neck wood. And so it has a brightness to it. It has the EMG pickups with an Aguilar OBP1 preamp inside. And so it has a very transparent sound. And that works in Neil Morris's music because it has all the bite, the crunch, and the punch, but it doesn't have any big grunty mid-range honk, which in the context of Neil Morris's music would be a problem because there's already so many keyboard and guitar layers in the music. There's no room for that. That's why I've figured out that's why this bass works so well in the music, is that it does what it needs to do in the music without interfering with the density of the music, because it's dense music. Neil Moore's music is not a lot of air flowing through it. It's very dense. So it just sits in the mix just right. Even Rich Mauser, he knows immediately. He knows, whatever he has to do to make the bass sound good, he can tell me immediately if, well, I'm fighting this, I'm fighting that. Okay, because I tried to use the other Spectre for the first 3 dates on the American run, and it just didn't work as well.
Gotcha.
So.
Well, and it sounds like with your sound and your voice, it is very specific to the characteristics of your instrument. Do you use any pedals or anything? My guess is it sounds like you're really honing in on what you're getting from the instrument itself.
Basically, I have a pedal board that has pretty much the preamps and effects that I use. And the two preamps that I use mainly are the SansAmp Bass Driver DI, which I have the deluxe version, and I use a Fender FBM1, which is the 59, or it's not a Fender, it's a Boss FBM1, which is the 59 Fender Super Bassman modeling pedal, which I use for cleaner tones. I'll use that for fretless, anything where I don't need it to be a little distorted. If I need it to be cleaner, not a little bit of crunch. The SansAmp is really good for the crunchier, traditional sound. My sound. When you hear it, it's that bass through a SansAmp.
Sweet.
So the effects, basically, I have a couple of Red Ripper distortion pedals. One serves as a very, heavy fuzz bass, and the other is just a slight crunch boost. So that if I want to get like that Mike Rutherford window weathering sound, or Chris's sound from either Relayer or Tails, that ritual bass solo sound, that kind of thing, then I can add a little of the other Red Ripper rather than having to reach down and change the gain every time I want a different distortion. I just put two pedals on there.
There you go.
And then the other one that I'm using predominantly is the TC Electronics Vortex Flanger, and then a TC Electronics Tremolo pedal, which I use in combination with the Heavy Fuzz for the beginning of Back to the City. It also makes an appearance in the opening overture Um, and so, yeah, so basically those are the pedals on the board with a tuner and my wireless receiver.
Mm-hmm.
And then the big unit right in the front in the middle is a Boss ES8, which basically I have all the pedals on all the time, and it just loops out through every pedal. And then I can program the combination of pedals in the order I want them to fall on and put them all on a button. So I can just hit one button and have two different pedals that are set to for one something specific like the tremolo fuzz. And I can hit another button and I can go to a different preamp with some chorus like for the fretless. Or that actually happens in this is a piece called the Slew in the new album. There's a place where I'm just playing the regular, crunchy Sanzam sound, but it needs to, in the album, it switches to a part that's kind of jazzy, so I kind of use the fretless bass, so I have a very different tone. So I need to be able to recreate that change live. And so, I just hit a button, and then I have the Fender FBM1 and the Vortex flanger. So it's great that you can just program any sequence of events in any order you want them on a preset just to be called up by hitting a button. Otherwise, I'm down there hitting 3 buttons to try to get from one sound to another, and I have to do it in the space of 1 quarter note beat, which, as you know, is kind of ridiculous. So.
I gotcha.
Aside of that, it's just bass pedals, which I use a Moog Minotaur for the sounds, and I use a Keith McMillan 12-step for the triggers.
Gotcha. And amplifiers?
Usually live, I'll be found playing an SVT, Ampeg SVT. I have an SVT4 Pro that I like. Usually that's what I have, but every now and then, if all they have available is like an SVT Classic or something, I can make that work.
Gotcha.
But, I can make other amps work. I already have my sound before it ever gets to the amp.
Gotcha. So
it really doesn't matter. As long as the amp isn't fighting me. Some orange amps were fighting me on every aspect of what I needed. I don't know what it is. But, like, in Finland, I use an orange. They give me an orange AD200 Finland. Mm-hmm. And the thing's on 1, and it's ripping the hair off my head.
Oh, wow.
And then that's why I have to wear a hat. So... Yeah, and so go figure, if every amp sounded like that, I'd never use another amp. That was an amazing. But it's that one in Finland that we always use, so it must belong to somebody in that area in central Finland. How many can there be, right?
Gotcha.
So, so you never know, it could be the way it's wired. But so walking into any situation where it's all completely unknown, I've found the SVT4 Pro to be fairly consistent. As well as the SVT Classics. They're just consistent everywhere you go. So gotcha. I plug right in and make it sound like I need it to.
Wow. Well, Randy, again, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. If people want to know more about, we've already talked a little bit about Neil Morseban's website, but if they want to know more about you, what's the best place for them to look?
Well, it'd just be randygeorgemusic.net. I try to keep everything there current. That's what I'm doing. You can find YouTube videos for pretty much everything that I've done there. I have some things for sale there in the store page, some of my releases. And, I just try to keep it up to date. Mm-hmm. NeilMorseBand.com for all things Neil Morse Band. Radiant Records for all things Neil Morse, including the Neil Morse Band. Gotcha. And all of Neil's past stuff and everything Neil sells online can be found there. All the VIP meet and greet packages are sold there. That's sort of the commerce center of the Neil Morse Band. Sure. The artistic website of the Neil Morse Band would be mostly NeilMorseBand.com. But everything ultimately leads back to Radiant Records at some point because that's the parent label for the band. So.
Very cool. Well, again, thanks so much for your time, people. You've seen Randy George talking to you. He's actually coming to you live via Skype from Southern California. You've seen it here on Bass Musician Magazine.